Hi everybody, it's Jen. Welcome back to my channel, Hallmark Plus More, where we watch and talk about shows, movies, mysteries, Hallmark ornaments, and anything else that floats our boat. So today I'm going to be reviewing a Hallmark Channel original series called The Way Home, Season 3, Episode 1. So before I get into the review, I just want to say thank you to everybody who watches, likes, subscribes to my channel, and watches my videos. I appreciate you so much. So I definitely want to say thank you. So when I get into this review, it starts out with the flashback because again, this is the first episode of Season 3. So if you have seen the show or you haven't and you're new to the show, I definitely recommend you go back and watch Season 1 and 2. This is about time travel, and I have to be honest, I haven't really watched any movies or shows with time travel. Not really something I'm normally interested in, but this intrigued me. This intrigued me on when I saw the preview 2 years ago when they first aired it for Season 1, Episode 1. I was like, oh, that's interesting. All right, you got me a little, thinking about what it could be about. And I watched it and I just fell in love with it. It's so many questions. I love mysteries, and every episode it makes you leave with more questions than answers, right? Every episode, it's so packed with not necessarily action, but just information because they time travel. There's another, decade that they're in, and then they're in real life, and it's just so fascinating. So I didn't expect to love this series as much as I do, but I do. I love it. I watched the first episode of Season 3 that we're going to review tonight, and I'm just like waiting for the next one. I'm ready to have a weekly discussion, right? I haven't felt this way about a series in a long time. I don't know if you've ever heard of the show How to Get Away with Murder. It starred Viola Davis. She is an amazing actress. If you want to watch a show that makes you think and think theories and spin theories, definitely watch that show. It has ended and it doesn't have new episodes. How to Get Away with Murder. That series has completed. And like I said, Viola Davis is amazing in that. She is such an amazing actress. But that's what made me think, how much I like this series, because my husband and I would watch it together, and then we get on message boards and we spin theories and see what everybody thought about the show. I haven't gone on any message boards about The Way Home, but it just reminds me of I could, because I could just talk and spin theories about this show for hours. So if anybody wants to spin theories or mention it in the comments, because I am totally down for a weekly discussion, because every single episode you're just like, oh, okay, what about this? And just, sorry for just kind of rambling on, but getting into the episode, it did have a cliffhanger from Season 2. And the cliffhanger was Jacob coming home and kind of entering his house. It kind of obviously went off before he went in the house. So that's kind of a cliffhanger when he goes in and Dell sees that, his her son is there, Jacob. So, and then the other cliffhanger, which I think we could talk about for hours, was Colton knowing about the pond and the time travel the whole time. Mind blown. Like, you kind of had your suspicions. Does anybody else know? Because Dell married Colton. It's Colton's family's farm, not Dell. So, I'm not surprised Dell didn't necessarily know about it, but, it's Colton's family farm. So, and then of course, when he passed, and he said, "My Catherine," it made you think, did he know about it? Because he kind of knew that was his daughter and future. So that was, I couldn't wait for this series to start. I was like, okay, show me Coulter, because you saw Coulter as a little boy knowing about the pond. And this episode didn't disappoint. I mean, I have like 3 pages of notes when I watched it. It definitely starts with a recap, as all episode 1s of a series does. And it shows, Kat time traveling and her and Thomas. I know a lot of people love her with Thomas. I think Thomas is a great character. His acting is great, the actor who plays him. However, I like her with Elliot. So I am a Kat and Elliot fan. As much as she was great with Thomas, I mean, he's from a different time. So I just felt like it was never really going to work. I liked, the little storyline she had with Thomas, but in my mind, it was always going to end. The end game is always her and Elliot. So, that's me always rallying for them. So, and then seeing that Elliot traveled for the first time too, and he was able to spend some time with Colton. So all of this is kind of in the flashback. So the first, 5 minutes of the show, you're seeing all this from before. And then, Kat notices the book and the photo and finds the journal with Susanna wrote. And that ends in season 2 as well. That's part of the cliffhanger, her finding the journal and reading through it. And documenting everything. And then, of course, Jacob finally coming home. So that was the big flashback. And now the episode really starts with new information after I go through all of that. The very first scene after, like I said, the recap is what I wanted to see, Jacob walking into the house. I was curious if season 3 episode 1 would have started with that, or if they were just gonna, go into him already being home. So thank you, Hallmark. I am so glad you started the episode 1 of season 3 exactly how our season 2 ended, with Jacob walking into the house. Like, it literally was like the last episode to the first episode, which I loved. And of course I got emotional, being a parent, being a grandparent, seeing Dell go through all of that emotion from season 1 and 2, and then her saying, "Is that really you, Jacob?" And just kind of embracing and having that hug and realizing, and then them sitting down with Dell and basically explaining the pond and what happened to Jacob. So that was emotional for me. And there was a scene from season 1 that got me choked up when Kat was lying in the bed and she looked up at the stars, and she had that flashback of putting the stars on the ceiling, which I'm sure you've seen. They've been around for decades. Everybody puts little stars on their ceiling, but she had that flashback when she was doing it with her little brother. And then when Jacob came home as an adult, in his 30s now, and sitting on the bed with Kat, and they kind of reminisced, and that got me choked up. Another thing that got me hooked when I first started watching this series, being a parent, like I said, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle, anybody, a foster parent. When you raise children, there's certain scenes and there's certain dialogue that are gonna get to your heart and get you choked up, because we're all human, right? And you're gonna get that feeling. So that hooked me right away in season 1, because I was like, oh, I can relate. And so them kind of, doing that scene again, or showing that again as an adult Kat and Jacob sitting on the bed, and then doing the little recap, really got me, because that reminded me of how emotional I got 2 years ago when season 1 came out. So I just loved everything, about this episode. I thought it was really great. I loved that, it goes back to Elliot and the end of season 2. He, hammered the wall and was breaking the wall and was going to do a reno. And they picked right back up with that. He found a clock in the wall. Don't really know what the significance is, but I feel like in this show, it's going to tie into something. So of course he puts it on his mantle. He doesn't just throw it away. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. I feel like when I watch this show now, every little thing, I don't want to let it slip by, because I feel like, like I said, I could have a weekly or daily discussion on this show and kind of, nitpick and analyze everything, because you really don't know. And it got us thinking. So you can spin so many theories. It's such a wonderful series that way. So, Hallmark did such an amazing job. Andie MacDowell is great. All of the actors and actresses are great. And then I loved when Alice showed the picture of Casey wearing the ring to Kat in bed. And, she basically, Alice was saying, "I think she's from the future." And Kat was like, "No, I spent all summer with her." But that goes back to a theory I'm sure, if you've seen the series, you were thinking in season 2 as well, because that was another part of the cliffhanger. And I say that a lot already, because there were so many different cliffhangers from season 2 that they're kind of opening up just in the first episode of season 3. And what I thought was interesting was Kat was like, well, she was never wet, like she was coming out of the pond. But there are so many little tidbits of information, things that Casey said, that makes you believe that she was from the future. So I definitely like, even though it was just a 2-minute conversation, I definitely like that. Hallmark did great in this first episode of season 3. They pretty much tapped on every single cliffhanger from season 2. Not necessarily in detail, but they hit on every one. Jacob coming home. They started with her, Jacob walking into Dell. The ring that Casey was wearing. They showed that several times. They showed Alice kind of like looking at it, and they addressed that. Elliot doing Reno, knocking down the wall, that was significant, and they picked that right back up in this episode. So they did very, very well in this episode to kind of hit on all of the cliffhangers from season 2. At least I think they did really well. And of course they'll expand on it a little bit later. They even clip, and that was all. And then 9 months later, right? Jacob comes home, and then you do the 9 months later. So he's been home for 9 months. And then you also, Kat goes and publishes Susanna's journal. So that was kind of another, not necessarily cliffhanger, but they discussed at the end of season 2. You really should be published. You need to write. She finds out Suzanne left a journal, and she kind of opens up the journal at the end of season 2. So that kind of wraps that part of it up too, because she gets it published in her name, which I think is amazing. She publishes a book and says the author is Susanna, which is definitely interesting to me. I love that she was able to do that. And then there was a little new thing that kind of rocks the boat, that I wasn't expecting. Dell is getting these letters in the mail, and they're not addressed. They don't have a return address, and they just say somebody knows, you know what I mean? And it doesn't really tell you what. It kind of reminds you of like I know what you did last summer. It's just one of those things where I know what you did last summer, and you don't know where it came from, and you don't know who it is that knows, and you don't know how much they know. That's what it reminded me of. Because she's getting these letters. She doesn't know who they came from, and she doesn't know what they know. She just knows that they know something, or they're willing, and so it kind of scares, I think, Dell a little bit. And it's obvious from that one scene, she hasn't told Kat, she hasn't told Alice, she hasn't told Jacob, she hasn't told anybody. But I do like those little monologues that Dell has, where she sits on the bed in front of her full-length mirror, and she talks to Colton. And, sometimes you see Colton sitting on the bed next to her. Most of the time you do. When she starts the monologue, you see she's by herself, and that you see Colton there. And obviously he's dead, so this is just her imagining him sitting next to her. But I love that, it kind of just brings back all of that grief, all of that loneliness that Dell had, right? Her husband dies, her son disappears, then her husband dies, then her only daughter leaves and doesn't talk to her, has her child, Alice, and never sees her for 18 years, right? So, Dell was really alone. And again, this wasn't her family, it's Colton's family farm. So she felt obligated to keep that family tradition, not knowing about the pond, because again, she was married into it. And Colton apparently knew, we found out. But, you kind of, I always would feel bad for Dell. She's really just been taking it all on her own. So I loved it that they brought in a romantic interest for her. You saw that in season 2, and apparently they're still together now, even though they said 9 months later. So she's still with the young gentleman, or I should say older gentleman she's seeing. And I love that because, you want everybody to have a happy ending. When you see somebody go through a tragic loss, you want them to find love again, right? Especially when she's been through so much. So I love that they still have that love interest. And I feel like he's such a good character for her. So I'm happy that 9 months later, this man is still dating Dell, and she looks like she's happy with him. Still doesn't let him in on the secret, which I think is a good thing. Just leave it within the family. And Elliot, of course, which is kind of welcomed into their family. I feel like Coulter kind of made him feel like part of the family. And, like you saw him time travel, and he had that, 5 more minutes with Colton. So even though he's not technically family, it's kind of wrapped into as family. And I feel like Dell included him in that when she said it doesn't leave the table, right? And then, I like that Kat traveled back one last time, and she kind of just closed that chapter. You know, she told Thomas, she told Susanna, Jacob made it back, he's safe. And I feel like that was needed because, like I said, I'm not a fan of Kat and Thomas. I like Kat with Elliot, but I like that, you know, she confronted Thomas and they had that dialogue. Because she was angry that he faked his death and didn't tell her. And so I feel like she needed to get that out. And I totally understand and kind of agree with what Thomas said. Well, I wasn't sure I was going to make it because he could have shot me in the head. So, I mean, you know, I understand why Thomas didn't tell her, but I feel like that conversation needed to happen. Kat needed that closure. Like, she was kind of upset with Thomas and she needed to kind of have it out with them. She was surprised to see him, but I think that helped the closure. And then seeing Susanna, I was a little taken back with Susanna's kind of, you know, pushed off or pushback that she had. However, I kind of understand it. I mean, you know, she's fearing for her life. She doesn't want anything to happen to Kat. But I thought she would be more welcoming to Kat. But again, it was 9 months in her time. But remember, Elijah said it's only been 5 days. So he's still in pain because he was beat up because they couldn't find Jacob. So maybe Susanna just didn't have time to process it because it's only been 5 days for her too. So, you know, maybe that's why she had a little bit of animosity. I'm kind of surprised Kat didn't tell her she was published because before she time traveled, Kat was like, Susanna would be so happy to know her name in print. I wish I could tell her. So I thought when she would time travel, she would say, hey, Susanna, I published your book. You know, keep writing in the journal because in the future it's going to be published. So I'm kind of surprised, even though Susanna was a little harsh to her and wasn't too friendly, I'm kind of surprised, you know, Kat didn't just tell her about the published book. So that surprised me, but, you know, like I say, I kind of understand Susanna's under a lot of pressure, and this is still so current. You know, to Kat it was 9 months ago, but to them it just happened, you know, 4 or 5 days ago. So, you know, she probably still had those feelings of everything going on with Jacob leaving. So definitely glad she went back one last time. I kind of hope it was the last time she goes back because I'm not really sure what more they can have on that storyline, right? Jacob isn't there anymore. He's staying in the present with Kat and Alice and Dell. She went back and told Thomas, Elijah, and Susanna that Jacob is okay. You know, Thomas has to leave town, right? Because everybody thinks he's dead. You know, Susanna is still writing and keeping that hidden, and Elijah, you know, so I feel like there's no need for them to go back in that time period. So to all of the people that love, you know, Kat with Thomas, I really don't think we're going to see much more of him. Even though I loved his character, he was a great actor, I always kind of wanted her with Elliot. So I'm definitely glad that 9 months later they're still together. And of course Elliot wants her to move in with her, which I hope she does, because like I say, I like that. I definitely like that relationship. And maybe Kat will see the clock. Maybe the clock will be, you know, it'll resonate with Kat or Dell, because I feel like that clock, I mean, who breaks a wall and finds a clock and then keeps it and puts it up on the mantle? So I could be totally wrong, but I feel like that's going to come into play at some point. So again, I am just like analyzing everything. So I hope, you know, you're not too thrown off by me just kind of analyzing it all. And then, of course, the episode, as always, it ends with a cliffhanger. Alice sees somebody run. She almost like sees a shadow of somebody run through the window, and it's night, and she goes out, and I'm like, it's the pond, right? So she goes out and she follows them, and she looks around the pond, and she sees a sweater, you know, like a sweater that somebody had left, and she's like, you know, I'm getting goosebumps right now as I'm speaking to you about it, because it just like gives me goosebumps thinking about that exact moment. But she feels like she's not alone, right? You get goosebumps when you feel like something's going on and you're not alone. And she calls her mom and says, hey mom, somebody else is time traveling, like somebody else is here. And then they push her into the pond, which floors me because whoever this person time traveling is probably related to Alice or Kat or Dell or Colt, related to the family. And they literally push her into the pond. And that's the last thing you see. She's on her cell phone. Of course, whatever past time she goes in, they might not have cell phones if she goes back. I'm thinking, at first thought, I'm thinking she's going to the future, right? Because we were talking about Casey being from the future, and I'm thinking Casey is, Alice's child or Jacob's child or something like that. I'm thinking they're connected, obviously, because the ring is Kat's engagement ring that she gave Alice. So Alice would either gave it to her child or her nephew or her niece. So they have that necklace. So that's got me thinking. So that was my first thought. But then you see the previews for the next week and you see a young Colton and Dell, which I love because you want to see that Colton and Dell love story. So I'm really looking forward to it. So it makes me think, okay, Alice is going to time travel back, not necessarily all the way back to where Kat was, but she's going to time travel back to the 70s and see Colton and Dell together, which, like I say, I'm excited to see. I'm excited to see their love story because Colton, you can really tell that Colton and Dell really loved each other. And then while they're celebrating Elliot's reno before this, because obviously that's the last scene, the pond, to give you that cliffhanger for next week. But while they're having this, celebration that his renovation is done, and, that's when Alice sees the person run by the window, they listen to a record and they hear Colton's voice, which they're not surprised by because Dell gave him the record. But then Dell leaves and Kat and Elliot hear Alice's voice singing with Colton. And you're like, okay, now she's going to time travel to the 70s. Like, I was thinking the future because of Casey, but once you hear that record, you're like, nope, she's going to go back, because how else could Alice be singing with Colton if she never met Colton in real life? She had to have time traveled, right? And met them when obviously Alice is a teenager, so she met Colton and Dell when they were teenagers, and they sang together and recorded an album. How Alice, doesn't remember because it hasn't happened yet. So, I mean, I would have loved to see one of them travel in the future because, again, I definitely think Casey from last season was from the future. And the reason why I think that is some of her answers, right? You never know where she's staying. She showed up and she was very interested in being involved in Kat's life, and that was like, okay, because you're related to her, right? And some of the things, like she delivered the letter, and that was part of the flashback. She delivered the letter to Dell saying that, they're not going to sell the farm. Well, it wasn't the lawyer. It wasn't like, how does she get a hand of these papers? You know what I mean? Like, there were certain things that I'm like, how was she the mediator behind it? You never saw any of her parents, kind of like when Kat and Alice would time travel. Alice didn't have any parents to report to. They never really thought anything of it. And Casey kind of had the same questions. So definitely excited. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of my review, every episode with The Way Home leaves me with more questions than answers. They do answer my questions, but then they give me more. So like I had a ton of questions at the end of season 2 with the cliffhanger, and they answered most of them, but now they gave me a lot more questions for, season 3, episode 2. So I think that's what's so great about this show and why I love it so much, is it makes you think, and you can just spin these theories and talk about it with other fans, and it's wonderful. That's why I mentioned earlier, my husband and I watching How to Get Away with Murder, we would spin theories, we would get on message boards, and it was just fun because you're not just watching a show, you're interacting with other people and, thinking what they say, like, oh, well, I noticed this, or I noticed that, or, I noticed the clock. Maybe somebody else will say, well, you should have saw the writing. I paused it and I saw something. And you just kind of see things people don't see, and you really just kind of get to, think about another situation or another plot that could be going. Whether they go by it or not, it's still fun to kind of spin those theories. So I hope you enjoyed my review of The Way Home, Season 3, Episode 1. I enjoyed it immensely. I could talk about it for hours, and I'm definitely looking forward to next week. So I hope you enjoyed my video, and until next time, I will see you then. Bye.